Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dan Nessel Show. I'm your host, Dan Nessel. We're going to talk business today. Now, I know I have my limitations when it comes to general business skills and acumen. And that's okay because as a communicator and a marketer, I don't need to know how everything works. But I do have to know what everything or nearly everything means. So it really surprised me when I started reading my guest's latest book and discovered that I may have a much larger role to play as businesses learn to deal with crises all around us and become a force for good. The fact is, we all have roles to play. As organizations move beyond just chasing profit and learn that they've got to be chasing positive societal impact, they've got to change, often in radical ways. They need us, executives, employees, customers, and all stakeholders, to make it happen from the inside and out. How? Well, we'll have to ask today's guest. A marketer turned academic and entrepreneur, he spent the last 20 years or so as a professor, dean, and administrator at universities in the US and Asia. He's concurrently the chair of business transformation consultancy Brand New View and professor of practice at the University of Oregon's Lundquist School of Business. A prolific writer, he's authored 11 books, including his latest, Radical Business: How to Transform Your Organization in the Age of Global Crisis. A leader in sustainability, on a mission to turn business into a force for good, please welcome to the show, John Davis. John, it is good to see you.
Hey, Dan, thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. I wish I got that every time I walked into a room or a dinner with a family. That'd be lovely.
Oh, I get that sometimes. Thank you for that. I get that sometimes. And look, I mean, I'm only scratching the surface here, I think, as our listeners will soon learn. First of all, I'm really humbled and pleased to have you on the show. You know, you're introduced to me by Dr. Michael Netzley, who is, a mutual friend who I had on early days of the show to talk about neuroscience and neuroscience of aging in particular. So when he says, hey, you need to talk to somebody, I always listen. And my show's evolved a little bit since then. And one day I have to have Michael back on because I think I didn't do him as much justice as I would like to. But anyway, he met you in Singapore, and that's part of your story. And I'm just thankful. Thank you, Michael, for introducing me to John. Right. And John, I mean, we just mentioned Singapore. How did you get to where you are now? I mean, you're a professor at Oregon, but you've been in academia for 20 years, a lot of that in Singapore. What's the journey like here? It's pretty fascinating. We'll get to your books for sure shortly, but I really want to get that context out first.
So this context may take longer than you anticipate. I want to, before I actually get into the answer there, I will say something. I did see Michael recently when I was back in Singapore in September. And it was great because he spent time talking with the group I was working with about his continued work in neuroscience. And it's really powerful and amazing. His organization is very strong, and I think it's gathering some great data. And I'm glad he connected us. The context for the work now is interesting. I'm going to simplify my career trajectory because if I go into the details, you'll begin to think that I'm just talking about so much spaghetti. But the first half of my career was in business, both as an entrepreneur and through Fortune 500 companies. As you mentioned in the introduction, primarily in marketing and or strategy related roles for those organizations. And that includes the startups too. I mean, even though I was starting them and co-founding them with others, I was principally the one that was thinking about how do we go to market and the ways we reach out to customers and target audiences. But around about 2000, I was given a talk up at University of Washington at the business school. And next thing I know, I got invited to teach in their executive MBA program. It's an interesting question about how that seemed appealing to me at the time, because my full backstory is I come from an academic family. Both parents, academics, grandparents are academics, both my brothers, aunts and uncles, niece and nephew. And it's like a family business that we have to be in. And so the first half of my career in business was kind of a reaction to that. I did not want to go into academia. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to see what business was like. But in giving that talk at the University of Washington and getting that opportunity to teach there, in their executive MBA program, I fell in love with the classroom. And it's hard to describe what that sense is like, but you all know it when you get into a project or something you're doing that is so electrifying and so compelling. And for me, it was like a laboratory space to share ideas with students who were really engaging and lots of experience. And I was learning from them, probably far more than they were learning from me. And that just turned the switch on. And the next thing I know, to your question on Singapore, I had an opportunity to go over to Singapore and join the faculty at Singapore Management University, which is where I met Michael Netzley, who you mentioned before, and spent many years there as a professor of practice, headed up a center called the Center for Marketing Excellence. And that led into a subsequent position where I was dean at the S.P. Jain School of Global Management. And fast forward, I then joined Duke University's Duke Corporate Education and headed up their Asia business, came back to North America. And then I left them on my own in 2021 because I wanted to work on the book, Radical Business, which I know we'll talk about. And then that book actually led to kind of what I'm doing now at the University of Oregon as a professor of practice and sustainability. So that's sort of a nutshell of the journey, probably more nut than shell, but there you go.
The road to the University of Oregon leads through Singapore. Could be the title of your of your biography there. It's interesting how Singapore, is indeed a nexus or a sort of, I don't know, it is the modern, Silk Road in some ways, where all the roads kind of meet there. And I spent some time there, not as an expat in Singapore, but I've visited a few times, and it's hard not to think after reading your book, your amazing book, Radical Business, how you must have been influenced a little bit by your time there, and especially when you talk about smart cities later in the book, you do specifically call out Singapore. But was there something about your time there that made you start to think, you know what? I mean, I think I really want to dig into sustainability as my thing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it was very early on. And to frame it more broadly, the work I actually did in marketing in my career was less about the block and tackling of MBA taught marketing, which was important. Those fundamentals are great. But I was always into but what does this mean for the organization? How are we actually contributing to society? What are the things we're doing above and beyond the products we sell? So that nucleus was always in there. I just hadn't had a chance to really unpack it or uncover it fully. And then Singapore absolutely brought that to life for a number of reasons. You've seen it, you've been there, but it is a garden city. In Southeast Asia, it's 1 degree above the equator. So it's a tropical location. It's hot and humid all the time. And they have really turned it into a garden paradise in terms of just what it looks like visually. It's arresting in a positive way. They really are very thoughtful about the way they plan the city and the smart city location. They're building a new development called the Tenga Eco Park or Eco Town, which is this fully self-contained, sustainable community where there will be no cars visible. They'll be all underground. You'll be within 5 minutes walking distance, 5 to 10 minutes walking distance of a bus station. All this great stuff. I mean, they're thinking through the parameters. So living in Singapore is great, partly also because it's a place where a lot of people from around the world end up being for their international assignments, or they set up shop there, or they become permanent residents. And so you have this remarkable accumulation of talent in a very small geographic space. And it's really fun because those people they call them third culture kids. So their families live in different cultures, and they may never have been in their home country when before the kids were born. So it's fun for them to kind of share those experiences, and you learn a lot from that community. But they're also seasoned veterans, right? And so they also have a really big lens on the larger world. And very little of it was about chest beating. Look at my title. Look what I do. Is much more around the experiences they had undertaken and things they'd noticed. The really careful curation and curiosity they exhibited around how people live, what they do. It was very non-businessy in the way you'd have conversations with colleagues and friends. And it was much more around what are these experiences like and what do they mean for us? And I know that sounds so philosophical, but it was actually really invaluable. And it opened my eyes to how to look at life more broadly, differently, more intentionally. Singapore was a very powerful experience. Plus, through the work in the universities, it was a springboard to working with companies in dozens of countries, literally. I mean, we all over Asia, all over the Middle East, all over Europe, down in Africa, Australia, New Zealand. Honestly, it was just this wonderful, you kind of look at yourself and go, how did this actually land in my lap? And I was so lucky to have that happen that way. So all those insights were really fun. And it was because of being in Singapore.
I had the pleasure, of course, Michael has been on the show. I mean, a few folks from Singapore have been on the show before. I spoke with Kyle Hegarty a while back. I don't know if you know Kyle. He wrote The Accidental Business Nomad, and that's why I sort of say, yeah, I'm talking to all these nomads, even though like nomad implies almost you're directionless in some ways, but and I don't think that's your case. But sometimes you find yourself out there and you go off plan and you just kind of go from discovery to discovery. And the way that, the place that you live and the people you interact with, of course, have major influence on what you end up creating, what you end up being curious about. You said curiosity a few times, and that's something that I'm keenly curious about. In your book, you do talk about that as well, about like, and it's one of the surprising factors for me that what an important role curiosity plays as a quality of leadership, but also as a quality of like strategy in some ways. Like you need to encourage curiosity as part of in order to move into a sustainable future. Like you have to be curious about things, learn, discover, innovate, right?
Yeah. It's a really important point that you make, because one of the many different insights and revelations I gained over time living and working overseas, we had this great opportunity for years and years and years to work with some of the biggest and most respected organizations. At first you think, well, gosh, isn't that great? You get an opportunity to work with XYZ company, their Fortune 5 company, or whatever it might be. But what was actually more appealing about it was the level of honesty that they had, particularly the top levels, to say, you know what, we can't get ourselves out of a particular rut that we're in. We are finding that we're struggling to, whatever it might be, innovate, name your challenge. And we need to figure out how to get ourselves out of that. And so we would work with them to literally try to unpack what that meant. But it almost always began with, they realized that they'd kind of stifled their own intellectual curiosity in an effort to get things done, to manage the numbers, to be successful day to day, to ensure they hit their quarterly targets, and so on. That becomes a set of blinders that force your head below the weeds. And as a consequence, you're really looking at the depth of the roots, but you're not seeing the horizon. And as simple as that metaphor sounds, beginning to expose them to the realization that they have to have this much broader vision, this idea of being able to take notice of the signals out in the marketplace, to be a cultivator of new insights, to avail yourself even of contrary opinions and points of view. A lot of different things that will provoke and stimulate your imagination, even if they're, again, contrary to how you see things. It can only help make them get out of those ruts. And so, yeah, curiosity to me is one of the imperatives, not just for organizations, but also for all of us. There was a great quote years ago from the co-founder of IDEO, David Kelly. And he was in front of an audience, and he said, look, one of the biggest lessons he's learned is about how to kind of cultivate this sense of wonder about the world. And he calls it traveler's eyes. And traveler's eyes is that wonder, that sense you get whenever you go to any place new or some experience that's new. It doesn't have to just be international travel. And the first thing you notice is that everything is different, right? You notice that the sights, the sounds, the smells, everything is different. And that kind of puts you, as he frames it, into sort of a state of high alert. High alert doesn't always have to be as a defensive posture to get away from a threat, although it certainly can be too. But it's also a way of just opening your mind up to the things that you notice that are different, and being comfortable with being uncomfortable with those differences, right? As opposed to trying to fight those differences because your own view says it should be your way. So I always appreciated that traveler's eyes kind of metaphor that he used. And to me, that is really the epitome of curiosity in any context. Again, you don't have to go international to do it. It could be, just exploring some new place, some new routine that you do, but you begin to notice it stimulates different kinds of imaginative responses.
The way that you're describing this is like almost like I'm not going to say capstone, but it's certainly an advanced level kind of explication or course. If you look at all the things that we've talked about on my show over the 90 something 100 episodes or so before this, where I have people coming in to talk about, various parts of business, marketing, communications, talking about coaching, talking about personal development, all this kind of stuff. But curiosity is a thread that runs through, as is being comfortable with discomfort, stretching, as is mindset. And you do make a big point of this in your book, early on in the book, where you talk about the learning and the growth mindset that's absolutely required for a corporate culture. And what I want to say, and we'll get to that. There's I was telling John before we started this show, by the way, listeners, that the book, and we will link to it. The book just provoked so much thinking for me. And you all know that I do tend to jump around with different topics here and there, but the book provoked so much thinking that I really keep thinking of ways to interpret what John is saying. And I want to bring some of this to bear. So please bear with me for a second. But in the book and beyond, I mean, some of the things you're describing really evoke this whole idea of reinvention. So just go back a level or two before we get into the book. Transformation, reinvention, they're not necessarily the same thing, but typically a transformation does require a degree of reinvention. Or you may think they're the same thing. I don't know. That's up to you. But this whole idea of businesses needing to reinvent themselves because the world has changed is something that we've talked about. So what are the big drivers out there, right? Let's take it to the highest level here. The big drivers that, influenced you to write the book that you saw needed to be addressed. And, maybe some of the top takeaways that, people should have in mind as they think about what they need to do, and hopefully read Radical Business to get there.
Yeah, so a number of drivers. So to preface this, the work over the past 20 years really has kind of culminated in this book. And culminated makes it sound like the final book. It's not. But I look at as you saw in reading through it, the frameworks that are in there are not one-time, conveniently created for the purpose of this book. They are a summation of literally years and years of experience of working with organizations and testing out some of the different models that are in there. And then as a number of different converging crises, as I refer to them in the book, have become so evident, it became clear to me that I think a lot of the lessons I've seen in working with organizations have potentially profound insight and blueprint pathways for them to figure out how to deal with some of these crises. And I do use the word crisis. I know that sounds dramatic, but I think it's important. So the drivers, let's talk about that. Obviously, we know about the climate crisis. It's hard to refute the evidence. And so I'm not even going to go down the path of those who do.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't mean to interrupt, but this is not a political show, right?
Right.
We're talking about facts. We're talking about, your interpretation of the way things go and what's in the book. And that's the way it is. And climate is absolutely something that we often talk about. So this is fantastic. Please, keep going where you're going with this.
Yeah, well, listen, part of it to me in the world that I think we've all created for ourselves around this planet, evidence does matter. And it's not the sole determinant of direction, but it is certainly a powerful influencer. And that's why I look at things like the climate crisis and the science behind it as an important factor in considering how we deal with it, right? Another key driver is the continued actually accelerating economic inequality worldwide. A third driver is social injustice. There's food insecurity. There are a number of different sort of major crises that are impacting us all. And then, of course, as I finished up the writing of the book, there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so these things don't end, unfortunately. And as a consequence, the question to me became, given what I've seen with organizations and what good ones do and what mistakes they make, is there something that can be done to help them to, as you say, either reinvent or transform themselves? And I do think there's a way to do it. I don't think it's easy. Nothing we do is easy, obviously. And if it were, everybody would do it and the planet would be healed. It's not that case. However, ignoring it just because it's convenient to do so and it's less expensive to stay the path of what you currently do is also not a recipe for long-term success. So what are the factors what are the factors that influence some of those big drivers? So we know that, for example, in the case of climate, and in the case of sustainability in general, environmental issues and so on, that more and more consumers worldwide, the majority of consumers worldwide in developed locations, are keenly interested in what the companies they buy from do to be a part of a purpose-led approach to society. And they will absolutely vote with their spending away from those companies that no longer represent their values. So there's a majority of consumers now worldwide who are in that camp. They are well ahead of most companies. And so the companies are reticent to follow up on that because there's a shareholder issue at stake for them. They don't want to lose the earnings and so on. But the bottom line is that they need to find a way to pivot differently, because ultimately, as Wayne Gretzky, the hockey great, once said, he doesn't skate to where the puck is, he skates to where it's going to be. Well, the consumers are going there. They're already there. And the question is how quickly companies can make that pivot. And so I think that's really important in there. There's a second component to this, not just the consumer side, but another reaction out there is the capital markets are starting to shift in favor of sustainability and ESG-related investments. It was once sort of fashionable. It was once considered extreme, back in the 70s during the original sort of environmental movement. A very small handful of organizations thought about this. There were some tracking stocks that did this kind of thing, but very little. Last few years, it's really taken off. You're seeing large funds like BlackRock and Larry Fink the last several years now talking about the importance of climate disclosures in the way they evaluate the companies in which they invest. And so capital markets do make a difference, and that's important to persuade businesses, because as businesses start to think about their access to capital, that access to capital is going to be increasingly tied to whether or not the business is discernibly and demonstrably sustainable, right? So that's really important. And I think a third, and I'll end with this, there's many other factors, but a third sort of influential factor are people who are particularly well positioned to wield an outsized influence on things. Now, what do I mean by that? There are certainly people like Mark Benioff, who's the CEO and founder of Salesforce.com, and who's one of the biggest proponents of stakeholder capitalism, who has set up Salesforce in a way that really represents, I think, the values of having a properly diverse workforce and compensating people well and so on and so forth. Are they perfect? No. But we need more Mark Benioffs out there, because they also, because of their outside sort of influence, have a capacity to pull others along with them. And we're seeing more and more doing that.
So, okay, there's a lot here that I know we can dig into, and we will, and that's great. No, this is fantastic. But let's go with the last thing first, which is like, okay, Mark Benioff, and right now, as we sit here and discuss this, this is going to be aired probably in January, February time, like so early 2023. And by that time, this little bit will be old news. But Elon Musk has just taken over Twitter, right? And this is no matter where you fall on pro, con, it doesn't matter. You're talking about an individual with an outsized influence who can affect and has indeed been affecting change. If it's the right change or the wrong change, time will tell. Benioff is similar, right? Because Salesforce is it should be called it should be called Nature Force, or might even just be called the Force, because it is everywhere. It is ubiquitous. It wasn't this way from day one, but everybody needs, like a lot of companies absolutely rely on Salesforce. So Mark Benioff has built an empire in some ways that he knows, right, that he can get away with pushing and pushing and pushing, right? He knows that, and if we can only hope that he's motivated in the right way, because he does have that outsized power, and so far so good. But he knows he has this whole like monolith or I don't know if that's the right word, but this massive company behind him and the funds to match. How can the non-Benioffs of the world, like the obviously leaders who are of smaller companies, leaders of mid-sized companies, or even up and coming and aspiring leaders, kind of start to emulate that? How realistically, without having a soapbox?
So a really good question for a couple of different layered reasons here. So you're right that someone like a Mark Benioff and similar kinds of personalities have a distinct advantage in trying to create momentum and a movement in this space. And for those who are less visible, they're still dealing with the blocking and tackling of simply trying to make their company survive, let alone thrive. And I understand that. And the simplistic answer, and it is simplistic, is to say you got to start somewhere because the market's moving in that direction. But it's too easy to say that.
True.
It is much easier if you're a startup, for example, to automatically say, when we get our products or services and whatever we're developing to market, we want them to absolutely stand for, let's say, one of the UN 17 SDGs. You can start from scratch much easier. The harder transition are for established organizations trying to make the pivot. And there's no way around it. You can't do this cost-free. Mm-hmm. But any decision you make in your company, smaller, mid-size, less visible or not, is always involves some level of risk. Whether you're investing in new plants just because you need to produce more widgets, whatever it might be, there is going to be a cost attached to that. You wouldn't ignore threats to your business and your strategy unless you do so at your peril. Well, You've got to look at some of these things as threats to your strategy now and integrate them into the strategy, irrespective of whether you have big influence or not. Because at the end of the day, if you are a small business, a mom and pop, a mid-sized business, you're publicly traded, privately traded, you're answering to some kind of a shareholder somewhere, whether it's yourself and your family or close friends, or whether it's a small public market. And you really got a pretty simple equation, which is if we want to get ahead to where Wayne Gretzky's public puck is, then we need to start making these investments now, so that we don't, in 10 years' time, scratch our heads and say, "Gosh, if we'd only paid attention to this earlier, the pain would have been so much less back then than it is now." As we watch competitors scramble past us, and the market says, "Well, too late," right? Yeah. So basically it's action. You just got to take action. And I say that with all sincerity about the hard recognition of it's difficult to do this. But business isn't easy. Nothing we do is easy, No. Nothing is guaranteed. But we have a remarkable capacity to innovate too. I mean, one of the great things, and the reason why I love, using sort of businesses as the platform that can affect change, is because it does have this incredible potential capacity to create change writ large. And it's an innovative capacity. It's the gray matter between our ears. It's how we respond to threats. All of that to me spells a positive future ahead, but you just have to take those steps. Yeah. It's kind of like, there's some medicine that we have to take, right? I mean, it's pretty clear, especially if you read the book. And I do love the way in the book where I like outlines. I like kind of frameworks and, templates. And the book is one giant template. Like it's organized in 3s and 4s. It's, you have 3 themes, 3 major ways of looking at value. You have 3 major ways of looking at, how to deal with this transformation. And then within each, there's just tools and templates and models that you've developed. Sometimes you juxtapose them against older ones, like where change needs. So I think a strategist, a specialist, from a strategist or specialist all the way up through to a general business manager, will find a lot in this book to choose from, right? To get started, like to find something. Okay, here's something that I can do first. In fact, sometimes you say, here's what you should do first in the book, right? But what, all that's to just say that starting where you can start is probably, what you're saying there. Start where you can start. Just take that first bite of the elephant, right? And you'd mentioned the 3 major
three major, not the three, but three major, I think, drivers here was consumers, capital markets, and influential people. Going back to the consumer for a moment, right? I wrote down a couple of things you said earlier about weak signals and understanding, where the puck is, right? Listening to the consumer, interacting with the consumer, and let's just expand that even to all stakeholders, really, because there's, consumers are a major stakeholder, but there are other stakeholders, investors, employees, and so on. Listening to them, understanding where they're at, you lay that out as something that you have to do. How would you suggest people get started with that to just start to get a grasp of what the zeitgeist is in your field, in your industry, so that you can discern what those weak signals are and understand the direction to which you may need to pivot or innovate?
Yeah. So listen, I think one of the great models there is human-centered design or design thinking is a great metaphor for that. And for the simple reason that what it has brought to so many organizations worldwide is a discipline around asking the right questions up front in order to understand what your target audience is looking for. I kind of hate using the term target audience because it makes it sound so antiseptic. Mm-hmm. So let's think of it in the context of who is it you're trying to
persuade, influence.
Yeah, exactly. And I think to the latter point on stakeholder, then that's important. And it begins with saying, what is it we need to learn from our stakeholders in order to make them feel like they're invited into this big purpose-led tent that we're creating. And those will be different conversations. They are really important. Your shareholders are still important. They're just not the only stakeholder of consequence. As you mentioned, consumers or customers, if you're a B2B enterprise, are really important. Your employees, your supply chain, your executive team. There are community groups in which your operations are based that are important. And it may sound like, well, gosh, everything is important. And the short answer is, well, yeah. I mean, the way business was framed 50 years ago, was a really simplistic look at the world because there was really one dominant economy, and that was the U.S. And it was pretty easy to kind of rubber stamp your way around the world. The world is no longer like that. It's a lot more complicated. And therefore, recognizing that complication in the way you approach your stakeholder conversations is also critical. And frankly, these stakeholders wield a lot of also outsized influence. Consumers as a group, obviously, as I pointed out earlier, are doing that. But, when you start to look at sustainability, things like scope 1, 2, and 3 levels of sustainability concern are really an issue too, because you've got to think about your value chain members and whether or not they're really aligned with what you're doing. And then the downstream impacts of the work that they do and the logistics involved with that, it suddenly becomes quite large. And to ignore it, again, is to say either you're not completely on board with it and therefore you're really not sort of fulfilling your ultimate strategy, or you're greenwashing, or you're just kind of leaving yourself short. And somebody will blow past you. And if businesses still care about having a presence, I think then they would think about that holistic view of that presence. But I want to caution here too, because I think there's also a misnomer. Well, it's a misnomer now. It maybe 50 years ago was different. And that was, we can always grow, right? And we can always compete against somebody else. And I think we're in a world now where we recognize finite resources are real. We can't always grow every economy all the time, every business all the time. There are different ways to think about how a business creates value, however. And that is, things like well-being and whatnot that we ought to be considering. And it's not always, sometimes it is, but it's not always about just beating the other company, as badly as you can. It sometimes involves collaboration, cooperation, because in effect, you are trying to create something that benefits all of society somehow. So why not see if rising tide does float all boats? I suspect it does.
I agree with you. I mean, obviously, I agree with you. The idea that small changes have to happen and incrementally, and if you do not change in some way, if you do not get on board with the transformations that are necessary, you're going to be left behind. If nothing else, capital markets, you mentioned earlier, are already all about ESG. And, especially if you're a publicly traded company, ESG is an interesting kind of formulation as well, because we still don't have it really well defined, right? I mean, it's almost like, I forget who the person was. Maybe it was not a great person who said this, but it was like, I don't know art, but I don't know what art is, but I know it when I see it.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of, it's kind of like ESG is kind of like that. Like, I don't know what a good societal improvement is, but I know it when I see it. Or I don't know, there's a consensus that has to build around it. There's like a general idea. Okay. Yeah. There's judgment happening, but there's no maybe there is, maybe this, but it didn't seem to me. And even in the book, I was getting this impression that there's still not a solid metric that people can say, yes, we're making progress with the societal thing, or we're making, our E is really, really great right now, or the GM. You can look at D&I statistics and measurements inside your company. You can look at these things, but there's nothing like agreed upon that this is a benchmark, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually a really interesting point. So as you say that, just this week in my class with my MBA students, we were going through the different reporting standards out there, SASB, TCFD, GRI standards, and so on. And they're all really interesting. And in some cases, they're sort of overlapping each other. And in most cases, it's difficult to determine which one you use, right? Most of them are also kind of structured in a way that makes them friendly to investor audiences, which is good because the investor audience who's going to make determination on whether a company is authentically, credibly sustainable through its ESG initiatives, is used to seeing annual reports and quarterly reports and whatnot a certain way. And so these standards are an attempt to try to frame it that way. But the caution there, too, is that the standards are not perfectly refined, although I would argue that even the standards we require of companies in just average, normal, expected annual reporting are also not perfectly refined. There's lots of ways to engineer those results and to interpret what retained earnings means and whatnot. And so the absence of perfect clarity in here should not stop companies from beginning the journey of trying to decide. Even if they select one, maybe they design an internal one and also complement it with one of the external standards. If we wait for perfection, we will be hanging ourselves. So it's really important.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I was going to ask, was about this whole idea of waiting for perfection, because there's so much at stake, especially the larger the company is in many ways, with all the different moving parts, and you have a lot of internal stakeholders. It is turning the battleship around rather than the cruiser, right? So you're trying to, and as a communicator, one of my roles is to say, look, we really need to be paying attention to ESG, folks. And I'm not the only voice. I mean, it's not like we as a company, and to Lixil's credit, pace very, very close to. I never have to ask that question. I never have to say, hey, we have to pay attention to ESG. Everybody knows this. It's in the culture. We're on the way. But I can imagine that there are a lot of places where that is not the case. So it must be, I'm just thinking it must be a mark of decision-making almost capability where that you have to do something, but moving forward with a particular program, for example, right? There's let's name one, like moving forward with a D&I program where you decide, okay, we are going to increase the percentage of women in the workforce by 50% from where it is now within 5 years. I think for an HR department or for a CEO to go forward and say that, their first worry is, well, what if we don't hit that goal? Right? What will the stakeholders then? What's going to happen to our reputation? The communicators say, what's going to happen to our reputation? The CEO is going to say, well, what kind of investment do we need, right? So I think the instinct is to question and then talk yourself out of it in some ways, right? So I really don't know what the question here is. I'm just thinking like it's a difficult climb. And I would say that the answer probably is to read Radical Business and kind of look at those checklists that you have so that you can get going. But is this something that you encounter a lot? Is this something that you do whether it's in your classes or with Brand New View?
Yeah, so definitely in the classes and actually in the work that I do with other organizations as well. It comes up Specifically, it can relate to things like DEI, but it can also come down to questions of, how do you make the right strategic choices about what your business stands for that represents its doing well by doing good approach to society, right? And
Yeah.
I want to talk about the DEI thing for just a moment here too, because it's interesting. There are different cultural contexts attached to that. So in North America, we obviously know what the trigger points are for that, and it's a balance of men and women, and it's also ensuring that there's proper representation across all kinds of groups, sexual orientations, and everything else, and that's really important. In other countries, sometimes it's diversity of thought, diversity of experience, because they may already be quite diversified or diverse as a population. And so recognizing what that definition is, even if it's a US-based company that defines it in the US this way, it may actually have a different context for that same company in a different market.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of pay attention to those nuances. It's not easy to do, but it's important to do.
Yeah.
And I also think it's a healthy discussion to have, right? Even if you don't hit the numbers, to your point, where I think you get into trouble, any organization get into trouble, is if you lay out this 5-year hypothetical journey. We're going to be 50% women, as you say, in a certain kind of position or whatever it might be in the organization, and you don't hit it, and you suddenly surprise the market in year 5 that, oh, we missed, then you probably deserve every single arrow heading your way. However, if you are en route, along the way, kind of at least saying, here's the progress we're making, here are the obstacles we're facing, or here's what's happening, and you're informing the marketplace and saying, we're trying this, we're trying that, there's a lot more forgiveness that'll be allowed. It's not to say that if in 5 years, even with all the transparency, you haven't moved an inch, you'll be forgiven. You still have to make progress. But sometimes, is 46% okay versus 51 or whatever it might be? It might be okay as long as it makes authentic, true sense because of the way you've described the path and the journey. I think we all are sensible enough to know when there are things that interfere, cause us to stumble and make mistakes or whatever. What isn't acceptable and what isn't tolerated is when we don't learn from them, and when we try to hide them, and or we try to say, well, it's not workable. I think everything is workable. It's just a matter of will.
Yeah, clearly you have to be it's again the comfort with discomfort, isn't it? So it goes back to mindset. It goes back to buying into this whole idea, which I suppose that if you run a company and you just don't buy it, and you're like, nope, we're going to just kind of muddle through. Our widgets are for widget lovers, and widget lovers will buy our widgets, and who cares what's going on in the world. I think, there are people who still think that way, and they're going to, I agree with the fundamental, hypothesis of the book, which is you can't do that anymore. If you continue to think that way, you will be extinct.
Right.
And your company will be gone. So you need to radically change your business. Into that early stages of change, right? What do you think are the things that are really, it's just to kind of dig into the book a little bit. What would you pull out to say, you need to get your workforce, you need to get your mind thinking in this direction? Like what are this? I know it's a big question.
Yeah. But it's a very big question. It's a very fair question and a very difficult one to answer. But I do think it's important for any organization to, even if they have a sort of quote unquote a purpose, as we now define it these days, to take a look at that carefully and see whether or not it's aligned with the context of. That's really critical, right? And I look at that as aspiration, and that's answering the big picture question: why are we here as an organization? What is it ultimately that we would love to see happen if we do everything well, right? And what's sort of our endpoint? And that's a very big abstraction, and it's a difficult, uncomfortable abstraction for organizations to deal with, because it's not a spreadsheet, it's not a return on investment analysis, it's not a we hit our numbers or we didn't hit our numbers approach. That stuff is all mechanical. It's hard, but it's still doable. Thinking in the abstract about what your aspiration is a far more involving effort. And it's not just sitting down for 2 hours with a group of executives and inventing a slogan or something like that. It is thinking intentionally about what is our mark on this world going to be well past our legacy as leaders of this organization? What do we want future generations to be able to do because of the work that we do? How does it improve society? If you get that nailed down, it doesn't have to be perfectly spelled out, and it's not a 500-page plan, and it's also not a 3-word slogan. But at least if you've got a guiding star, that then helps put in place what your next follow-up steps are going to be. How then do we decide how we're going to be distinctive? What are the kinds of people we need involved with this? How do we then create meaningful experiences? And we take it on into, the other aspects of what makes an organization successful, including stakeholder engagement, things like that. But I do think it begins with aspiration. And if you don't have one, then it's a great time to sit down and think about it. And honestly, there are a lot of organizations that surprises me who don't have that. They have a mission statement. It's posted all over the place. It's on the bathroom wall, and nobody pays attention to it. And that, to me, is an empty exercise. So it really does create an imperative for organizations to say, you know what? Let's put a stake in the ground and say, we stand for this, and this is where we're going. And even if we're not there yet, we need to get there. Start with that.
Yeah, it's interesting to point out the difference, and that's how your book starts out, really, with talking about aspiration, what your ultimate dream is, and getting there. I think sometimes we feel, and speaking as somebody who has a corporate hat on all the time, sometimes we feel like, okay, we're going to have another discussion about purpose. We have to keep talking about purpose. We have to keep talking about behaviors. Let's talk about purpose and behaviors and how they align, and let's talk about values. But to kind of ladder that all the way up to aspiration is a vision question, isn't it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So yeah. Especially when you're talking about employees and what motivates them, to get them moving and kind of help you to steer your ship, and you point this out quite well in the book about, the employees as an audience that, or as a stakeholder, really, that we have to keep working with. Getting your employees on board in the culture is critical. Like you need to have the aspiration, that dream first.
Yeah.
Yeah. And getting there is just, I think so many companies just don't do it. Like the work is too hard.
Yeah, and you're right. And let me just interject on that too briefly, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's interesting about that is this is not a panacea. It's not a Pollyannish look. It's not to assume every employee is always going to be totally 100% engaged. I think it's unrealistic.
Yeah.
It is, however, to say that, people want to know that their work matters. They want to know that they're contributing to something more than just earning a wage. Yes, I completely understand. There's definitely a need to survive, putting food on the table. And I get that.
Yeah.
And it's so much richer and better if the way you're doing it makes you feel like you are having impact. And there's a good friend and colleague of mine from Duke. He's still there at Duke. His name is Tony O'Driscoll, but he talks a lot about this idea of discretionary effort. And discretionary effort in some is a above and beyond the expected kind of effort somebody puts forth because they really believe in what an organization is doing. And it's really evident in those purpose-led organizations where people just go, gosh, this stands for something, and I'm making a contribution to what we stand for. And it's not about me and my name out in lights. It's about the greater good, the collective effort we undertake to make this happen that does make the majority of employees feel like that connection to aspiration is helpful to them.
That discretionary effort, I've been looking for words to describe something like that for a while. Thank you for that.
It's not me.
We always talk about
you got to thank Tony O'Driscoll.
Tony Driscoll. Thank you, Tony Driscoll. The reason is because, you felt it, everybody's felt it in these last couple of years with the pandemic. We're now off clocks. And unless you're a frontline worker or a healthcare worker, or you're in a particular environment for a fixed amount of time, hey, bless all of them. Please, you've had a harder time probably than many of us have or ever will. But for a lot of us now, there's been a sea change, seismic shift in the way that you're able to manage your time and your day. And that whole idea of discretionary effort, of putting in time beyond the clock, I think it's still really with us, right? It's still this kind of industrial revolution thinking of of, your 9 to 5 job, no matter how much people talk about it, it's still in there. And I think the younger up and coming generation might, now, especially with the last couple of years, is certainly in a different place, but still even them, through school have been inculcated to believe that you have to sit in some place for a certain amount of time. And then after that time, you're off. So culturally, I think there's a big systemic issue here.
Sure.
I'm thinking. Yeah.
There is a big systemic issue here. And you're absolutely right. I think that the notion of that 9 to 5 beginning and end to a day is gone. I'm sure it exists for people mentally, for those who kind of grew up with that thinking. And it is much more of a kind of a dynamic set of spikes and peaks and valleys during the course of the day, right?
Yeah.
There are going to be times if you're working remotely where you may be productive for a couple of hours and then you take a couple of hours off, but your day may begin at 7 and end at midnight, but it's still sort of a lot of hours put into it, but it's put in differently. And so, it's the notion of what a productive, good work day is like is absolutely different. And I personally have never been a creature of barriers. I don't like having lots of guidelines myself. So it's nice to know that there's that sort of fluidity that's involved with that. But there's still got to be at the end of the day some sort of accountability or something that says, okay, you've got more freedom. Great. And that is actually really important. So let's just help us make it as productive and useful as possible so that, we don't feel like we have to impose artificial 9 to 5 barriers on people.
If only. It's it'd be, but we're trying, we're really trying. And it's been a learning for so many of us. And speaking as a Gen Xer, I believe that we are the most flexible and most interesting people on earth, and we can deal with anything because that's just who we are. But even then it's like, okay, so what? I'm working an extra 20 hours this week. You still think in terms of that. I'm working a block of extra hours rather than I'm just doing what I need to do to achieve my purpose. And if, that discretionary effort, I love doing this because, I'll give you an example. From my work these days, I've really gotten into innovation. I don't mean like inventing new things, although I love that, but I mean innovation in the sense of directed, strategic. Like, okay, what do we need to do? What do we need to lose? Right? What are the weak signals in the marketplace that we can look at, and how can we, create some experiments to address those signals? And from those experiments, are we able then to extrapolate, a new model for something or a new thing to do or something to, like more directed. We've been playing around with something called not playing around. I was in a course with through our company based on the 3-box solution. I don't know if you've heard of that from Tuck University. Dr. Vijay Govindarajam. I'm hoping I'm get that right. He likes to call himself VG, but it's out of Tuck and it's the 3-box solution. Really cool, like innovation model, but one of many. And I spoke to somebody recently about jobs to be done theory, like everything you hire things to do things for you. You don't buy something, you hire something, to perform a job for you. But thinking about this, so I've been really into it, thinking about like, okay, how do we innovate? But for me, it's been really focused in the area of my profession, communications. Like, what are the innovative things that we can do in communications to better connect with people, to better not just reach our stakeholders. That sounds so businessy, right? But it's like to better connect, to better build relationships. And to do that, just to bring in to go where I'm going here, this discretionary effort, I don't see a difference between me doing that for my own enjoyment and doing it for my company. So I'm like, oh, this would be great. I'm going to create a new like metaverse staging area for training for my company. I'm going to see what that's like.
Yeah.
Right. So, but I don't think like I'm putting in extra hours. A lot of people would though, it's a big mindset thing.
Yeah, no, this is great. So listen, just on the issue of innovation and framing, I love that you brought it up the way you did, because part of it is this, I think, false notion that too many organizations have, that innovation is a creative exercise, and creative exercise is left to the people in the corner of the room sitting in beanbag chairs and colorful shirts. And, that's not it. I mean, certainly that's true in some disciplines, the artistic side of it, I suppose, but it's much less about that. And it's much more around how you as a leader create an atmosphere in which people feel like they can have those purposeful experiments that you described there. Those 30-day sprints, 10-day sprints, 5-day sprints, whatever it might be, but in
Something.
and just the freedom to at least share ideas, however outlandish they might be, knowing that they won't be penalized for craziness. Or reasonable craziness. That I think to me is really the lifeblood of successful innovation organizations. The connecting it to people is really interesting because one of the things I think you saw in the book that I talk about in there is moving away from a model that I certainly learned in business school: segmentation, targeting, and positioning. It's a marketing metaphor. Yeah. It's lovely, and I think it's just kind of it's a nice little stepping stone for a very limited tool for trying to understand a marketplace. And instead, I look at it what I call cause, advocacy, and meaning, and that is trying to understand more around, number one, what drives an individual, not a stakeholder. Yes, we can call them stakeholders, but we're talking about people. So whatever that person's cause is, what gets them up in the mornings, what are they really enchanted and excited about, understanding that, and that comes from the questions that we talked about earlier, being able to have that ethnographic conversation. Advocacy means how can then, once I have identified that cause, is get them to become advocates for that, right? And it doesn't mean everybody becomes an outgoing ambassador and filled with joy and sharing that, although that's lovely too. But it's more about somebody expressing the confidence and commitment they have to this, that advocacy for, I really believe in what our organization is doing, whether it's for-profit, not-for-profit, government, whatever it might be. But then the final piece to that is the meaning piece, and that is if you can define their cause and you can get them to be much more authentic advocates, then you need to tap in as well to what gives their professional lives, their personal lives meaning, right? And that's a slight variation on the notion of cause, but it's actually really important. When you create meaning for someone, you're not just defining something for them in a sort of a really simple-minded way. You are actually tapping into a reservoir of motivation that says, "Wow, if I do this, it feels like it builds me up. It's additive to my enjoyment of life. It's additive to what I do and contribute to others." Now, all of this is around, I'm making it sound like it's all about me, the individual, the person. It's just a way of understanding people writ large. And so cause, advocacy, and meaning really applies to how we try to understand any kind of a population of people. But to me, it's a very powerful set of tools that goes well beyond saying segment, target, position. Segment is a demographic exercise. Targeting is a refinement of that, and positioning is a communications expression. It's not to insult it or denigrate it. It's just not nearly enough.
Well, I mean, that comes from, it's a little bit of an older way of thinking about marketing for sure. And, marketing is an evolutionary discipline. At least we hope it is. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the questions I was going to ask you, and you just sort of answered it for me, was like, what do marketers and communicators really need to start thinking about and do to move forward? And I wrote down, specifically with the CAM model from your book, because I think it's an example of approaching people from what really matters to them and what's where they are as people. Like, it's again back to connection and relationship versus where they sit, what their habits are. That's good information. Don't get me wrong, because you're right. Segmentation, targeting, all that is all still a thing. But really, if you can get into these people really, really care about clean water, right? Yeah. They are crazy. They're not crazy about it. I don't mean to say that. Well, I guess there are people, there are activists out there, but some people care about water so much. Well, we have something to say about that, right? Yeah. It doesn't mean I want to go sell them a shower or a faucet, but it means that I want to talk to them about water and I want to find out what they're thinking. So I want to find out more about their cause. I want to find out more about what is the meaning that drives them, and by extrapolation, can pull that into the way that we talk to the rest of our audiences and stakeholders. So it's really valuable.
Dan, can I offer something in there? Do I have time for this?
Yeah, please. Yeah, of course.
The work that you do is really important in water sanitation, hygiene, and just clean water in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to give you an example. When I was in Singapore, one of the exercises I used to do with my MBA students was I'd give them and the students came from all over the world. And big population from India, China, South America, Europe. It was really fun. But the exercise was they would each student or each group, actually I put them into teams, got a bag of things, and each bag was identical per team. So there might be 6 or 8 teams, but everybody had the same bag. And the bag would have things like a pipe cleaner, large eraser, masking tape, a piece of cardboard, and half a dozen other kind of related crazy items. None of them connected to each other. And the point of it was I'd say, now you've got 2 days. When you come back to class, design a prototype of a product and a marketing plan around that product. Okay.
Nice.
And so they would come back with these crazy designs. But what was interesting about it, so context here matters. So those from some of the more developed markets almost invariably came back with something that was a variation on a device, a new smartphone, a laptop, whatever it might be. But those from India, Pakistan, other places invariably came back with designs about how to create clean water systems for their farms or for their remote villages or whatever, because that's their context. In many cases, they were coming from places where this was not an obvious thing that we take for granted here. It was very powerfully important for them. And it was a revelation to me to realize, that context matters point is so underserved in our way we approach how our businesses serve our markets, cause advocacy, meaning, and so on. But it was really powerfully brought home to me, recognizing that there are enormous populations across this planet that do not have the same access to the sanitary water conditions that we take for granted here. And they're thinking about these things all the time. Anyway, it was a bit of a departure from what we're talking about, but the work you do is important.
Well, it's very related because, that's the kind of societal value that we should be thinking about. You're right. Societal value doesn't mean the latest gadget and innovation, although it could be, right? You could create a lot of value by bringing the next level iPhone in some way. Who knows?
Yeah.
But you're more likely to really create a difference in the world at large if you're looking at populations that aren't well served.
Yeah.
That don't have money. There's a lot of great stories about that. It's like there's a fellow who, and I wish I had that at the tip of my tongue, but there was somebody who took the idea of prosthetics, right? Prosthetic legs in the US and in Western world costs hundreds, thousands of dollars, titanium blades, just like all kinds of stuff. This guy said, no, I'm going to do a $5 or $10 prosthetic. That's it. So nothing revolutionary about a prosthetic device, nothing original, like it was a leg, a plastic leg. The revolution part of it was the price point, and the idea that they're all going to look the same. They're going to be the same, but they're going to fit well. They're going to be lightweight, and they're going to do the job. And next thing you know, folks in Sri Lanka are climbing trees with these artificial legs. And this fellow made this amazing innovation that changed the world in a small way. So looking at that was another thing that we learned in the Box 3 innovation program as well was, you need to be looking at underserved populations.
Sure.
And that's where a lot of innovation is going to happen. And it doesn't mean a new gadget.
It doesn't. And by the way, this is so much fun, Dan, because innovation also is not necessarily dependent on abundant resources. So an example, and this is not original to me, there's a great TED Talk by a person in the West Bank whose name is Maj Masharawi. She started a company called Green Cake. She's a chemical engineer, I believe. But here's what she did. Because the infrastructure there is through years of conflict and whatnot is dilapidated, it's falling down and crumbling and whatnot. She basically came up with after 200 or 300 experiments, she looked at the debris, the fallen piles of dirt and rubble and whatnot, and said, is there a way we can reconstitute this into building blocks? Because import-export stuff is really challenging there, and yet we need to have some kind of stabilized infrastructure. She created this thing called a Green Cake brick, and it's lighter, it's stronger, it's more carbon-friendly, and that allows them to kind of reconstruct those areas that have been destroyed or damaged or whatever. And she had no real money to do this. It was a series of experiments, as you pointed out earlier, to create this green cake brick. And it's a really good story. It's a great TED Talk. The TED Talk I think is 4 years old now, but take a look at it. And to me, it's an example.
And it's called
yeah.
It's called a green cake.
Yeah, green cake. Yeah, the color green and taste like a birthday cake. But I would not recommend eating this.
We'll put that in the notes. I mean, so we can go on and on about innovation. In fact, there were so many things that I have a list, and I was showing John earlier that I have pages and pages of like questions that occurred to me just when reading the book, which indicates, I think, to all of you out there that this is a book that's well worth reading and listen. And it's an important book. I think John lays out a plan. I think I said that at the beginning. Templates, a plan. Questions you can ask yourself: how to start, what you should be looking at, what all of these different terms even mean, what sustainability looks like, illustrated through case studies, primarily, from real people like that. I think the green cakes was not in the book, but other examples are, and it's just really relatable. Highly readable and important. So I definitely recommend, of course, everybody go and get it. I will put the link in the notes of the show. Again, it's Radical Business: How to Transform Your Organization in the Age of Global Crisis. John, before we wrap up, is there anything that's not in the book that you wanted? We just talked about green cakes, but is there anything not in the book that you want the audiences to kind of keep in mind, or is there or something in the book that you want to really highlight before we kind of wrap it up, or anything else really?
So I'll try to tackle both those things. So very quickly, to highlight in the book, the latter part of it is, I think you described it nicely. So the book is not intended to be the panacea that solves all problems everywhere. I wish it did, but I do think it's a starting point. It's a blueprint that can help organizations figure out what steps to take. And that was by design. I wanted to make it accessible so the companies could look at it and say, what do we need to do? How can we best think about how to reposition, how to reinvent our operations to go forward? That's really important. And I think it's the culmination of years of working with organizations and on the different frameworks that you see in here that shows that they work. That's why I wanted to put it in there. The other thing that I think is sort of a larger message to me, and it's a message about our capabilities as a species. I really do believe we have infinite capacity and capability to make the changes we want. And what keeps me up at night is, can we get there fast enough? I worry about stuff for my kids and, someday grandkids or whatever. And I worry about the next generation, just like a lot of people do. I'm not alone in that.
Yeah.
And I worry about, we get distracted by the shiny object stuff of, in our case here in the US, political wars or whatever it might be, which is all so much noise. And we kind of lose sight of sort of the things we really can't affect, which is change in how we conduct ourselves in the organizations, change in how we encourage our organizations to make changes themselves. And that we can have a positive impact and footprint on this stuff. We have the capability and capacity. And that actually gives me lots of optimism. And just to finally add the final point to this, and I see this now. I see this with my own kids. I see this with the students I'm so lucky enough to get to teach and work with. They really they're so far ahead of the rest of us in terms of what they want to get done and how they want to do it. So I'm really excited by that. And it's underway. This transformation is underway. So that's sort of my final point, I guess.
That's a terrific point. I think, I agree with you. Like the Gen Zs, the Gen Alphas, look at my kids. It's almost like if you start to talk about some of the, nonsense that companies have been doing for the last 50 years, there's like a cognitive dissonance. What are you talking about? That's not the way to do things. So I have my faith in them as well. I also am optimistic as you are. I think there's a lot of technological developments coming down the pike that are going to help us to really hold all actors accountable in many ways. Right now we're relying on reporting. We're relying on sort of methods of just trying to look into the value chain and look into like the supply chain and see where things are dropping off or where the good and the bad are happening. But technology is going to help us a lot to kind of validate steps and make the process faster easier, and then we can devote resources to other things. So I think there's so much happening that is, again, to me, optimistic. I think we're still going to go through a lot of crap, certainly as a civilization, as a society. But I'm also optimistic, as you are. And on that note, I think if you want to share some of John's optimism, and if you want to get a sense of John's optimism, obviously, buy the book. The link will be in there. Check John out on LinkedIn. It's John Davis. There's quite a few John Davises out there, but look for John Davis in the University of Oregon. And again, his profile will be linked in my episode notes. Check out brandnewview.com, and it's exactly like it sounds, brandnewview.com, for some of the things that John's doing with transformational consulting and helping companies and individuals, convening leaders to talk about this stuff. I think there's so much there, John. Twitter, it's one John Davis, the numeral one John Davis. Again, probably due to the number of John Davises out there, but I'm glad you're number one. That's an important thing. Did I miss anything, John? Did I get you at all the places you need to be gotten?
You got me. I mean, LinkedIn's the other one. People can reach out to me on LinkedIn too. Yeah. So this is great. Dan, I had an absolute blast. So much fun. Thank you.
I'm so glad. You can come back anytime. And, I will, next time, I know that you're working on 2 more books, at least according to your website. So next one comes out, I will shut myself away for a little while and devote some time to it and get a couple of notepads and once again, enjoy the explosive nature of your thinking as it enters into my brain. So thank you so very much for coming. It was a real pleasure, and come back anytime.
Thank you as well. Absolute gas.
All right. Thanks for listening to the Dan Nessel Show. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. People always ask me, why do I do the show? I do it for the ratings. I do it for your validation. So do me a favor. Go over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or someplace else, wherever you're listening to podcasts, and subscribe, leave a review, rate me, and share with your friends. Anything you can do to spread the word, I deeply appreciate it. Thanks again for listening to the Dan Nessel Show.